In this lecture, I plan to look at the fragmenting of Cnut's great North Sea empire and the emergence of more compact kingdoms in the form of England, Denmark, and Norway. And this next period of maybe 30 years after the death of Cnut saw two major issues at stake. First, down to 1042, the question was, would one of the surviving sons of Cnut manage to gain control of the thrones of England and Denmark and reassert authority in Norway, and so reconstitute the kingdom of Cnut under that royal yelling family? And that question ultimately would be answered no. Then from 1042 down to 1066, there's an extremely complicated political struggle played out at the courts of Rouen in Normandy, Winchester in England, and the courts of Denmark and Norway as to exactly who would succeed to the legacy of Cnut and exactly what portions of the legacy of Cnut would constitute kingdoms. And the result of this very complicated political history is three major battles in 1066 that essentially settled the issue. And what we will do in the second part of the lecture is look at that complicated struggle that climaxed in the final Battle of Hastings on October 14th, 1066, which essentially determined the destinies of Scandinavian England for the rest of the Middle Ages. Well, first let's look at the initial succession crisis following the death of Cnut. Cnut died in England, not unexpectedly. That's where he spent most of his reign, on November 12, 1035. Several months after his oldest son, Sven, died in exile in the Danish court at Roskilde. This is Sven, the older son, who had previously been king of Norway and had been expelled by his subjects. Cnut was given a burial at Winchester. He was received with all the honors of a West Saxon king. And from the start, there was a succession crisis as well as the question of what's going to happen to the realm. In 1035, probably by midsummer of 1035, the Norwegian jarls and lendermen, that is, the local rulers as well as the men of landed property, especially in Trondheim or Trondelag, in the northern sections of the country, had expelled Danish rule and had invited to rule over them Magnus the Good. He was the son of St. Olaf, Olaf the Stout, who had seized Norway back in 1015 and had been Cnut's great rival throughout most of Cnut's reign. And then St. Olaf had made a desperate bid in 1030 to retake his throne and had been defeated and slain at the Battle of Stiklestad by his own subjects in northern Norway on July 29, 1030. And it was that battle that ensured Cnut's position in Norway. Unfortunately, Cnut soon afterwards gave Norway over to his son, who immediately alienated the Norwegians. And so Magnus the Good had been called back in. He was about 7 years old at the time. He had been reared at the court of Kiev, that is Yaroslav, the Varangian Rus prince of the East. So that most of the affairs are being directed by the great jarls of Trondelag, who are fighting in the name of King Magnus. Although Magnus matured very quickly. By age 14 or 15, he was already had the capacity to lead men in battle and would turn out to be a very, very energetic and dynamic prince. So Norway was now independent from Denmark, and you have to recall that Cnut, as well as his sons, carried that ancient tradition, that ancient Danish tradition, that any powerful Norwegian sea king was by definition a rival, and that southern Norway was really part of Denmark, and northern Norway, by the way, should be ruled by jarls properly subservient to the Danish crown. Also in 1035, there were two brothers, half-brothers, each of whom had a claim to the throne. And it was a rather complicated and bizarre situation. The brother Harald Harefoot, who was the younger son of Alfgivu, that is, the first wife, the English wife of Cnut, he was in England at the time when his father died. He was at Winchester, so he in effect controlled the instruments of government in England, or could. Unfortunately, his mom, Alfgivu, was in Denmark. And in Denmark was Harald Harefoot's half-brother and rival, Hartha Cnut, or Cnut III, as he's often called, and he was the son of Queen Emma, the Norman lady, the Norman princess, who some saw as the more senior and important wife. She, after all, had been married to Ethelred II. Her brother was Richard, Duke of Normandy. She clearly had a great deal more status than Ælfgivu, who was just an English noble lady. And Queen Emma at the time, ironically, was in England. So each mom had the privilege of being in the kingdom of their stepson. Emma, however, was the more adroit diplomat. She had on her side from the start Earl Godwin. And Earl Godwin was an old-time supporter of Canute, a very powerful English family. He had 5 mature sons, all of whom ended up becoming earls in their own right, and one of them, Harold II, has the honor of being the last Anglo-Saxon king of England. And Godwin also had lots of connections in the Anglo-Danish elite. His family was popular in the Midlands and Wessex, and he backed Emma. And Emma and Godwin together were able to arrange a deal whereby Emma's son, Harthacnut, then in Denmark, was acclaimed king of Denmark and England together. Harold Harefoot was compensated with the understanding that he would rule England in the interest of his brother. We're not sure exactly what sort of title Harold held, whether it was king. Probably it was a royal title, and he was not just a jarl. But it was clear that Emma and Godwin were going to call the shots. Well, this was not very satisfying to Harold Harefoot, and fortunately for Harold, he was able to vitiate this agreement in 1037 and seize the crown of England for himself. And this was simply because dear brother, or dear half-brother, back in Denmark, Harthacnut, was too busy fighting the Norwegian fleet. The Norwegians were attacking Denmark. Magnus, or Magnus's supporters, to be more accurate, intended to put Magnus on the throne of Denmark, and then probably the Norwegians would happily sail over to England and take England as well. That enabled Harold to secure the throne in England. He did this by winning over those earls who were opposed to Godwin and Emma, including the great Earl of Mercia, Leofric, only known in popular literature as being the husband of the future Lady Godiva, but that's another story and a legend. In any case, Harold was now sole king in England. Well, Harthacnut could not let this stand, and he came to an unusual agreement with his opponent in Scandinavia, Magnus the Good, in 1038. They agreed to an armistice and a treaty, and this treaty was to have wide-ranging consequences. At the time, both of these, Harthacnut is a young man, Magnus is somewhere around 10 years of age, both of them expected to have long reigns and lots of children. But they came to an agreement that should either Magnus or Harthacnut die without issue, that is, without legitimate children to claim the throne, that the family of the other would inherit. So in the event that Magnus died without any issue, Norway would go back to Harthacnut, the kings of Denmark, and vice versa. Should Harthacnut die, then Norway could have the claim to the Danish kingdom and also the kingdom of England. Well, this gave advantages to both sides. Magnus's supporters consolidated control over Norway in the coming years, so that Magnus was uncontested as king of Norway, and Harthacnut immediately ready to flee to invade England. And before he invaded England, he did what all good kings do. He consults with Mom. Queen Emma had been kicked out of England. She was at the court of Flanders as an exile. Harthacnut sailed there to consult with Mom on important issues, especially winning over supporters like Earl Godwin. And he was geared up and ready to invade England in early 1040 when, unexpectedly, Harold Harefoot died, apparently of illness, at Winchester. Well, Harthacnut arrived with the fleet. The party's on. I mean, we're going to sail. He's received in England immediately. There's no civil war. And Harthacnut is now declared king of England. He has England. He has Denmark. And you know what's next in the game plan. He's going to raise all that money in England, sail back to Denmark, and take out Norway. And so Harthacnut happily rules as king of England and unfortunately overindulged himself. Well, the first act as king of England was to dig up the body of his brother Harold Harefoot and scatter the bones, and then proceeded to make his own appointments. Hertha Cnut, unfortunately, in June of 1042, overindulges himself at one of these great drinking hall parties. He's really very excited. He just raised something like, I don't know, 30,000 pounds of Danegeld and was ready to go, and promptly went into convulsions and died the next morning. And so, contrary to everyone's expectation, none of Cnut's sons ever reached the age of 25. None of them had children. The direct line of Cnut was now defunct. Well, now the treaty kicks in from back in 1038. Magnus, the son of St. Olaf, the king of Norway, the ex-king of Norway, now a saint, he has the right to claim both Denmark and England under the arrangements of that treaty made back in 1038. Well, he's not in much of a position to take on England, but he's certainly in a position to assert his rights in Denmark, and that's what they do immediately. In the spring of 1043, a huge Norwegian fleet shows up, and immediately the Danes at Viborg in northern Jutland, which is regarded as the most important thing in the entire country, agree to accept King Magnus of Norway as their king. This is the first time that a Norwegian sea king, any kind of Norwegian royal figure, was accepted as king by any group of the Danes. It marks a great triumph. Magnus, in many ways, proved a far more adroit and able king than his father, St. Olaf, did. And we'll discuss St. Olaf and his various mistakes in an upcoming lecture. But at this point, St. Olaf is now a canonized royal saint. And by the way, St. Olaf is always more dangerous as a saint than he was ever as alive to Cnut and Cnut's family. So Magnus looks like he's ironically going to end up being the successor of King Cnut, that he's going to go on to take Denmark and England. Now, the English nobility, really Godwin, moved quickly on the matter. They decided that they didn't want a Norwegian king and immediately came up with the brilliant idea of inviting back to England Edward, known as Edward the Confessor, the son of Queen Emma, that is the stepson of Cnut, who had been in exile at Rouen and for all intents and purposes was a Norman. In fact, Edward the Confessor would have preferred to have been a monk and writing nice manuscripts. He spoke Norman French, probably couldn't even speak English, really was very reluctant to assume the throne of England. He was trotted in by Godwin and the leading families in England for that very purpose. They hoped to rule England as great regional lords through this weak, essentially Norman-trained king. And the history in England from 1042 to 1066, when Edward the Confessor dies, is really a power struggle among the great families of earls, these Anglo-English families created by Cnut, as to who can control the throne. And if this situation had continued, if there had been no Battle of Hastings or Norman conquest, England could very easily have broken up into those regional kingdoms that you would have seen before the reign of Alfred the Great. With Godwin's family getting the greatest prize, which would have been Wessex and Mercia. Godwin marries Edward to one of his daughters, and throughout the reign, there's a series of power struggles, even a brief civil war, where Godwin, for a short time, is out of favor. And it's clear, certainly by 1062, certainly by then, that Edward is failing. He's going to have no children, and there's already a maneuver going on among the English aristocracy of who gets the royal prize. And Harold II, the oldest surviving son of Godwin, his older brother Sven had died, had predeceased him, eventually ends up getting acclaimed king in early 1066. Well, as that is being played out in England, what is happening in Scandinavia? Well, it looked like everything was perfect for Magnus, that he had Denmark. In 1043, he was elected by the thing in Viborg. England was next on the menu. He did take time to impress upon his Danish subjects his ability. For instance, he defeats the Wends, that is the Slavs on the southern shore of the Baltic. He's probably responsible for torching Jomsborg, the base of the Jomsviking, and bringing that professional company of Vikings to an end, because they're closely associated with the Danish monarchy. What Magnus didn't count on was not only the machinations of Godwin in England to put this bizarre Norman-trained king on the throne of England, but also on a man by the name of Sven Estridsson. I affectionately call him the rubber man of the 11th century because he always managed to bounce back no matter how bad the defeat. And Sven Estridsson was the nephew of Cnut. In fact, no one really paid much attention to him through most of his reign. Most of Cnut's reign. Sven was known by his mother's patronymic, Estridsson, son of Estris, who was the half-sister of Cnut. His father was Ulf, the Jarl who had ruled in Denmark and who had been disgraced for treason by Cnut. Sven had been essentially a hostage at the court of Cnut and then Cnut's sons, and escaped and made his way to Sweden, that is to the court at Sigtuna, where he was given support by the then reigning Swedish king to make a comeback, a political comeback in Denmark, and that's what he did. A year after Magnus had been proclaimed king of Denmark and went back to Norway to arrange affairs in his kingdom and to prepare for an English invasion, Sven came out of nowhere, got elected by the Viborg thing as king of the Danes, and immediately a war was on. And from that point on, down to 1066, for almost 22 years, Sven Estridsson fought usually a losing battle against his Norwegian contender. Sometimes it was Magnus the Good, and then the other candidate who came in to complicate it in 1045, 1046 was the half-brother of St. Olaf, that is Harald Hårdri, Harold the Ruthless, Harold Hard as Nails, as sometimes his name is translated. And he was, as I said, he was a Christian Viking in every sense, and probably had more in common with Odin than he ever did with Christ. Harold Hårdri, who had also been at the fateful Battle of Stiklestad in 1030, when King Olaf went down and soon to become St. Olaf, had fled east, first to Kiev, had made his way to Constantinople, and had served in the Varangian Guard. And he is perhaps the greatest example of the types of fortunes that could be made by serving in the East in Byzantium and learning the techniques of government, acquiring powerful warriors, and just like his half-brother, St. Olaf, making sure to have lots of good Icelanders around who can tell everyone about your great deeds and poetry. And he's an absolutely colorful figure. The Byzantines are impressed by him. He impressed the then reigning Empress Zoe, my favorite Byzantine empress, that silly niece of Emperor Basil II, who was the all-time high maintenance of the 11th century. And there's stories that she was ready to marry this great Norwegian king. And considering some of the escapades of Zoe, I believe it. In any event, Harold had better things in mind than worrying about this, 50-year-old empress and spoiled brat of niece of Basil II, when he had made his career in Constantinople and got word of the complicated situation in Scandinavia, he decided to return to Scandinavia, and he had a legitimate claim to being king of Norway as the half-brother of St. Olaf. On the way, he married Elizabeth, that is the daughter of Yaroslav, the Prince of Kiev, made an important alliance. He showed up at the court of Sweden, immediately got in contact with Sven Estridsson, and the two of them teamed up to take out Magnus. Harold wasn't particularly impressed by Sven. In fact, most people were impressed by Sven. He walked with a limp. He was not a charismatic warrior. In fact, he never won a significant victory in his entire career. He's very good at rallying men. He was, however, a consummate diplomat, and one point different from all the other contenders, he knew that what he wanted was Denmark. He was not interested in taking on the entire inheritance of Cnut, that the territorial kingdom of Denmark was sufficient, and he very much thought of himself as a Danish nobleman and king. Denmark was what he wanted, Denmark was what he wanted to consolidate, and he never lost control, he never lost sight of that objective. And so Harold decided, with all the wealth of Constantinople and his veteran warriors, that he could probably do better if he teamed up with his nephew Magnus and took out Sven. And so what happened in 1046 was a very, very strange alliance between nephew and uncle. Magnus and Harold agreed to share the kingship of Norway. This was not a territorial partition, and again, it's an old Teutonic custom to provide realms for everyone. Under the deal, Magnus would have his own court and move around Norway. Harold would have his court. If the two kings presided together, Magnus would have precedence over Harold. Well, I think in the long run this wasn't going to work. Everyone knew that Harold who was considerably older than his nephews, about 13, 14 years older, was the greater warrior, had the greater amounts of money that he'd won in Constantinople, made the intelligent move of marrying a second wife, Thora, the daughter of Jarl Thurberg, who controlled the uplands, and Harold made sure to have guest ties, friendships, fostering marriage alliances with all the key nobility around the Oslo area and the uplands, that is the heart of the kingdom, and it was likely that nephew and uncle might have gone to war with each other, and happily for King Harold, Magnus too died unexpectedly of an illness in 1047. And one wonders, with all these young kings dying of illness, is there some mad poisoner out there, if you're into conspiratorial versions of history? But you have to understand, given the conditions and diet of the Middle Ages, it's very common for people to contract illnesses and die, and this just happens frequently, and that's part of the attrition of ancient and medieval populations. So, in 1047, Harald Hardrada is now the sole king in Norway, facing Sven Estridsson, and he had two important claims. First, he could claim that Danish kingdom. Second, he could also claim the Kingdom of England, because he was the surviving relative of Magnus, and under that old treaty in 1038, which Arthur Canute had made with Magnus, whichever one has heirs inherits the realm of the other. And so Harald Hardrada always thought in terms of, well, I get Denmark, I get England, and this is a restless, brilliant sea king who had the best warriors in the Northland, and he intended to recreate the exploits of Sven Forkbeard and Canute in England. What he didn't bank on was this rather unimpressive opponent in Denmark, Sven Estridsson, who checked the efforts of Harold to conquer Denmark, and so thwarted the plans to invade England. And this is despite the fact that Harold could invade Denmark repeatedly each year, sweep the Danes off the sea, ravage the Danish islands. In 1049, Hedeby is sacked. There is a major battle at the Nisa River in 1062 where Sven Estridsson has to jump ship in order to escape capture. It's probably the most humiliating naval battle suffered by any king in the Northlands, and yet Sven is able to make a comeback. In part, Harold became increasingly ruthless, hard as nails, as his name gives you, his nickname, short of funds, and lost popularity with the Danes by ravaging Denmark in order to pay his Norwegian supporters. Well, in 1064, Harold and Sven call a timeout, just as we had back in 1038. And what caused that, again, was developments in England. By 1064, the conditions were such that everyone knew Edward the Confessor didn't have long to go. That was known in England. That information is immediately transmitted to Scandinavia because of the close contacts among the kingdoms. And the question is, well, what happens next? Harold came to the conclusion that Denmark is too tough, an opportunity is developing in England, maybe we should shift to England, conquer England, and then with the resources of England come back and take out Denmark. That's probably what he has in mind. And he's encouraged in this regard by several other important developments. One is Harold's brother, Tassig, who had been Earl of Northumbria, that is the northern regions of England, the old core of the Danelaw, had been exiled. He'd been run out of England because he had been extremely unpopular. His earldom was given over to a guy named Morcar, who was the brother of Edmund of the Earl of Mercia. And Tassig was really mad, wanted to make a comeback, blamed his brother for not supporting him, although Tassig had done everything in his power to alienate the Anglo-Danish classes, and he was willing to raise rebellions in northern England and welcome Harold into England. And that was one of the important reasons why Harold decided to switch his interest to England. Furthermore, the only other possible candidates for the English throne had pretty weak claims in themselves. And there were two other men. One of them was Harold II, who was in effect the brother-in-law of Edward the Confessor, the leading earl in England, but he had no royal blood. He claimed, when Edward died, early in January 1066. And Edward had a very, very long illness. He was suffering a fever. He was tuned out half the time. Some people speculate most of the time he thought he was heaven rather than earth. And Harold II claimed that on his deathbed, Edward the Confessor had had a vision and made him, Harold, heir to the English throne. And, of course, there was no one to verify it except Harold. But, that was a problem in and of itself. Certainly, he had the supporters, the power, and the reputation to become King of England. He'd beaten up the Welsh in some campaigns earlier. That's always good for English reputation. And above all, he could command the loyalty of the Anglo-Danish ruling classes in England, as well as the housecarls, that professional army of 2,000 Scandinavian warriors. The third candidate was Duke William of Normandy. William the Bastard, as he was known, the illegitimate son of Richard II, Robert I of Normandy, and William the Conqueror, as he's known in later English accounts. He too had a pretty weak claim to the throne. In fact, his only claim to the throne really was that Harold had gotten shipwrecked in Normandy sometime back in 1064, and they had palled around together and beaten up the Britons, that is, the Celtic peoples of Brittany. Harold was really good on that, take out the Welsh and English, now we can beat up the Celts of the continent. And as a result of staying with King William induced Harold to swear an oath on bones that he would support William's claim to the throne. One wonders what that claim was really based on. There really wasn't any basis. But when Harold took the throne early in 1066, William immediately challenged it and said, no, I'm King of England. Harold knew that he would have to fight for the throne, and King Harald Hardrada of Norway had a claim, so you had three kings. A choice of three kings in January of 1066. And really all of them, in some ways, the best claim was actually Harald Hardrada of Norway, if you're looking at legal claim. But the claim was going to be enforced on the battlefield. Well, this comes down to the climax of what happens to the kingdom, the empire of Canute. Harold II, to his credit, had to face two potential invasions, one from the north. And you have to remember, in the English mind, the Norwegian threat was probably the greater. And there was good reason, because of previous invasions by Viking armies. Most of the spring and summer passed uneventfully. None of the fleet set sail. But in the early autumn of 1066, Harold had a real problem. Most of his militia forces, the third, their services expired. They went home. All Harold had was his royal forces. He was guarding southern England against the threat of a Norman invasion, and he really wondered whether the Normans could pull it off and put all those heavy, those heavy chargers, those horses on ships, and get those damn animals over to England and mount the Norman cavalry and win a battle. And then news came that a Norwegian fleet had sailed. The winds had been adverse all summer and had prevented the Norman ships from sailing from the French ports. But those same winds that held up William the Conqueror's army allowed Harald Hardrada to set sail under ideal conditions with a fleet of 200 ships. He joined up with Tassig, the exiled brother of Harold. He also made an excursion over to the Orkney Islands and picked up a lot of great Scandinavian warriors from the Orkneys in Scotland. And this huge fleet sailed along the shores of northern England, at that point over 300 longships, perhaps 10,000 warriors, and landed south of York and advanced on the city of York. On September 20th, 1066, Harold and his allies smashed the northern English army at the Battle of Fulford. It was a resounding victory. The two earls, Edward and Morcar, escaped. News flew south to Harold, who at this point only had his royal army. Harold immediately advanced north. And within 5 days of the first battle, Harold's army arrives from the south, covering 180 miles. These are men mounted on essentially souped-up Shetland ponies across the Roman roads. The English army actually goes through York and attacks Harold's army, which didn't even know the English were there. They were scattered, many of them without arms, and the result is a major battle along this little river known as the Battle of Stamford Bridge, in which Harald Hardrada in the Norwegian army is annihilated, in one of the great battles of the Northlands. Now, if everything had stopped at that point, Harold II would be remembered as the greatest English king on record, because he had won the greatest victory that any English king had ever won over any Viking army. We are told that less than 25 ships were necessary to take the survivors back to Norway. It was a colossal defeat. And yet,
King Harold II of Harold Godwinson of England wasn't going to be so lucky, because on September 28th, 3 days later, William's army landed in England, 6,000 strong, including 2,000 cavalry, and immediately Harold was on the road south to London, and then immediately headed south to confront William at Hastings. And on October 14th, 1066, the great decisive battle of English history was fought, which pitted essentially a Viking shield wall. That is, the Anglo-Danish housecarls, 2,000 strong with axes, supported by the English militia forces against the Norman cavalry. And it was an all-day affair. The English almost won the battle. The Normans never forgot how difficult an opponent they were. And as a result, Harold went down. He was killed late in the day. William won the battle and went on to take the Kingdom of England and established the Norman dynasty of England, which would henceforth transform England into a Carolingian-style feudal state. It also marked the end of any effort by Scandinavian kings to rule in England. But above all, it determined that Sven Estridsson would rule in Denmark, and that the family of Harald Hardrada would rule in Norway, and that 3 kingdoms, not 1 kingdom, would follow Canute the Great.